Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to this Dublin Festival of History event. The festival, as many of you will know, is an annual free festival brought to you by Dublin City Council, organised by Dublin City Libraries in partnership with the Dublin City Council Culture Company. And we're delighted to be able to have in-person events here in Dublin Castle today, and we're also live streaming the event via YouTube, so welcome to those watching online. Before we begin, I just want to remind you that you do need to wear a face covering while in the building, except when you're seated in the auditorium, so please feel free to remove them if you feel comfortable about that, and we'd ask you to maintain social distancing when moving about the venue. And also, we do have to clear the building between each session, so obviously you may visit a bookshop, but after that we'd ask you that you do leave the building. We will have time for questions at the end, but we cannot use handheld microphones. So as you can see, there are 3 fixed microphones down the room, and if you're selected to ask a question, please make your way to the nearest microphone following the directions of myself or Bert or one of my colleagues. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next event today, 4 Killings, Land, Hunger, Murder and Family in the Irish Revolution, Myles Dungan in conversation with Katrina Crowe. Myles is an Irish broadcaster and author. He's presented many arts programmes on RTE radio and has also been a sports broadcaster on RTE television. And since October 2010, he has been the presenter of the History Show on RTE Radio 1. Katrina Crowe is one of Ireland's leading archivists and historians and commentators. She was elected to the Royal Irish Academy in 2012, and I think, like Myles, Katrina is making a very welcome return visit to our festival. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll hand you over to Katrina and Myles. Thank you.
Everybody. It's kind of like being in an exam hall, isn't it? It's all very different to what we're used to. But no cogging. No cogging. It's wonderful for everyone to be able to be back at in-person events again, and for those of us who have the privilege to talk to you from a stage like this, to be able to see you instead of a tiny thumbprint on a screen, or worse still, the person who has blanked their screen and gone to make tea or gone off to do something else entirely because what you're saying is so boring. There's no escape out of this. That's the other thing. So you're all very welcome today, and I am delighted to be interviewing my old friend, Myles Dungan, who has, as you've just heard, a long and wonderful history. And we'll say a little more about that in a minute. So we began in 2012 here in Ireland to engage with a decade and a bit of significant centenaries, which led to the foundation of our state in 1922 and the ensuing civil war, which we're just about to start embarking on next year. It's been a complicated, fascinating, and largely successful enterprise, made possible by the release of important archives, which have allowed scholars and the public to explore political, military, social, economic, labour, gender, and perhaps most interestingly, family history. The 2 most significant archival collections are the Bureau of Military History, the oral history of the period from 1913 to 1921. Note they left out the Civil War. In the late 40s, early 50s, the Civil War was still too toxic to be dealt with in this way. And the Military Service Pensions Collection, which does deal with the Civil War, and that collection also deals with the aftermath, life for people after the revolutionary period, not just people who were active, but people who were affected, in other words, through loss, bereavement, dependency, and so on. These collections have opened up the personal histories of many people's ancestors, as well as answering many questions about the conduct of the conflicts. Myles Dungan has made an important, superbly researched and beautifully written contribution to our understanding of the period in this book, 4 Killings, Land, Hunger, Murder and Family in the Irish Revolution. I'm going to be able to ask him questions about this today, and that's the reverse of our usual relationship, where he has asked me many astute and piercing and sometimes frightening questions about all sorts of things in his capacity as the person who represents RTE's History Show, to which I'm sure many of you listen on Sunday nights during the all too short season during which it's broadcast, and we won't start beating that drum. It should be on all the time. I think there's a lot of people who really miss it when it's not there. Myles, as you heard, is a historian, journalist and broadcaster who has many books to his credit, including, very importantly, Irish Voices from the Great War, published in 1993, which is one of the most effective contributions to opening up the secrecy and silence around Irish families who fought in World War I. something that has grown and blossomed since, so that now people are no longer ashamed of having had an ancestor who fought in World War I. That does not mean we have to dance jigs of celebration about a particularly stupid war that caused huge numbers of deaths, but it means that people can acknowledge their own past and the complexities of why people might have joined the British Army then. And that was not an easy thing to do in the 90s. Myles and a few other people broke new ground with all of this and made it possible for us to hear and listen to things we needed to know. Other books include The Theft of the Irish Crown Jewels, 2003, The Captain and the King, William O'Shea, Parnell and Late Victorian Ireland, 2009, Conspiracy, Irish Political Trials, 2009, and the wonderfully titled Mr. Parnell's Rottweiler, United Ireland Newspaper, 1881 to 1891, published in 2013. You've heard from our kind introducer that Myles has a long career as a current affairs broadcaster, which of course he did, 5/7 Live and Today at 5, and of course Rattlebag, the arts programme. And much as I love Sean Rocks and Arena, and there not a word shall be said against him, I sort of miss Rattlebag still, even though it vanished from our hearing in 2006. And he often sat in on current affairs programmes afterwards. I know he's told me he hates doing it, but it's always marvellous to hear his voice on the radio telling us things about politics, because of course he's extremely well informed about all these things and is a bit of a politics junkie in his own way, just like me. Okay.
Used to be.
At heart, he's a historian, and the book we have before us today is one of his best, with the added virtue that it concerns members of his own family caught, like thousands of others, in a fast-developing situation which none of them had foreseen. So, Myles, you loved your granny, May McKenna, as was her maiden name. You begin and end the book with her, and the selective stories she told you about the revolutionary period when you were a boy eager to hear such stories. Tell us about her.
Yeah, I mean, she was a wonderful woman. She was a real, in that old-fashioned, in the way we now think of the word gentleman as a very old-fashioned kind of a thing. Lady is pretty old. I know that if you're in the GAA, the women's teams are still called ladies' teams. I still can't figure out why they don't just call them women's teams. But she was a lady, and when I knew her, she spent quite a bit of time looking after me and quite a bit of time talking to me. And she talked a lot, and I listened a lot. And I suppose I got a taste for listening from her, which helped in a broadcasting career. And she was absolutely fascinating. And she was one of these people who she enjoyed a lot. We were talking about P.G. Wodehouse outside. She would have been perfect in a P.G. Wodehouse story. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons why I love and still love P.G. Wodehouse, because my grandmother would have been Aunt Dahlia, not Aunt Agatha. She would have been Aunt Dahlia. So, yes, the kind-hearted aunt. And she would devour the newspaper every day, but it would be the previous day's newspaper, because my mother would have devoured that day's newspaper and then would pass it on to my grandmother. So my grandmother was always about 24 hours behind. But I suppose when you're in your 80s, it doesn't really matter if you're 24 hours behind. But she would read everything, and she would go right down, obviously, to the death note. She might even have started with death notices when she was in her 80s, I suppose. But she would read about things that I was fascinated about, which would have been sport, for example, which would have been about soccer. So she could have a conversation with you about politics, and she did that a lot, or she could have a conversation with you about, Leeds United versus Manchester United, and she could talk to you about Johnny Giles and Billy Bremner. She'd never watched, she kind of occasionally would, pass by a soccer game, and she thought soccer was very genteel, that it was always kind of after you, sir, and pass the ball around and all this kind of stuff. And I hated to disillusion her, particularly when it came to somebody like Johnny Giles, who was an absolutely wonderful. So I mean, I was I wasn't a rugby person. I was really totally besotted with soccer at the time. Now it's baseball, but that's beside the point.
If you start going on about sport now.
No, I won't. I'll stop talking about sport. Anyway, she could talk to you about anything. But what you're getting at is that every now and again she would break into recollections from from her I suppose she would have been in her 20s at the time. She was newly married. And she would talk about the War of Independence. And she would talk about the Black and Tans. And she would tell me scary stories about the Black and Tans coming to the house, ransacking the house, what they were looking for. She was never quite specific about why they would be going to her home in particular. She wasn't particularly specific about either. And, threatening to burn down the house, which was something that she was very scared of because it did happen, and it happened in quite a number of instances. And I lapped this up, and there's no doubt about it that she infected me with an antipathy towards our nearest neighbour, which has never quite gone away, I have to say. And, partly as a consequence of these nasty men with, Birmingham and Liverpool accents coming and disturbing and threatening my beloved grandmother. So, at the age of about 10, 11, 12, I swallowed all this. Then as I got older, and as I went to UCD and studied history under, Kevin B. Nolan, all the names you studied them, Dudley Edwards. Yeah, Dudley was getting a bit beyond it now, I have to say. By the time I got there, he was going a bit gaga. But F.X. Martin, Kevin B. Nolan, all of the greats of that period, the people who really brought up Irish history in the 70s. And I began to get skeptical about my grandmother's stories, and I began to think that, okay, right, why in the name of God would the Tans have been bothered to go and roust out my grandmother? And then about 15 years ago, I was having a conversation with a cousin of mine, a first cousin of my mother's, who started telling me about her father and her uncles and their involvement in the War of Independence. And that's when I discovered, and I did not discover this from my grandmother, that 3 of my granduncles, of her brothers, were in the IRA in Meath, in Cavan and Meath. One she did talk a lot about was another brother, who was a man called Justin McKenna. And Justin McKenna was elected in 1920 as a TD for Louth and Meath. He was in the Rath camp in the Curragh at the time. And he became a TD, a Sinn Féin TD, and voted in the treaty. And she was very proud of him and talked a lot about him. I'm sure she was very proud of her other brothers, but she was not particularly proud of their IRA activities. And it was through a cousin that I learned that they were involved and got interested. But I certainly did not get any of that from my grandmother. She talked about her own experience. She did not talk about her brother's experience.
So she sort of lit the flame.
She lit a fire, definitely.
But she was very selective in what she took, which is not an unusual story in the Ireland in between, I suppose, the end of the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
And the beginning of the 80s when people, I always remember the story about Jean Kerrigan, the great journalist, watching Calton Younger, who wrote the first book on the Irish Civil War, on the Late Late Show. And he was there, he was grown up, sitting with his mother and his aunt. And he said, "What Civil War? We had a Civil War here?" Okay. History in school finished in 1916.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yeah.
Which was a real con job.
Yeah, yeah. Unless you were taught history by a Republican priest who was a leading member of the IRA,
true,
then you did the Civil War.
Then you'd have the Tans.
So I did actually know about the Civil War. Anyway.
You were lucky, or not.
Or not.
So, 4 killings, it does what it says on the tin in this book. 1 in Arizona, 3 in Ireland. 2 of the dead are your relatives. 1 was shot by a relative, and 1 was shot as punishment for shooting a relative. So I'm going to ask you to take us briefly, because we want to get to the end of this before we move to questions and answers, to take us through them all. Start with Jack Clinton, who, quote, you say, fell foul of 2 of the unresolved issues of the fast-expanding American West, infatuation with gun violence and perennial quarrels about land ownership. He died in Arizona in Cochise County.
Cochise County,
in 1915, and the name of that county points to another unresolved issue in the Old West. So he's a sort of outlier. I'm not saying get him out of the way quickly, but just give us a short version of what.
Yeah, I mean, he's an outlier in one sense, but in another sense, he's related very much to the subject matter of the book, because were it not for the land struggle in Ireland and all the problems that we have had with land over the centuries, he would never have been in Arizona. He would have been farming in County Meath. So in that sense, he's very much an integral part of the book. And also because of the fact that he was, like his nephew, 5 years later, was killed over land. And Jack Clinton was one of a number of homesteaders in Arizona. And I don't know how much you know about American history. I'm sort of totally besotted with Western American history, and I've written a book about the Irish in the American West. But 1862, Civil War is going on, and you have Congress passing the Homestead Act, which permits ordinary people to buy land mostly in the western states of America. They can buy 160 acres, and they don't pay there and then. If they're still there after 5 years, they pay literally a couple of dollars for it. And it enabled people to acquire their own land. So that's what Jack Clinton did. He'd married a Mayo woman in California, Delia Varley. And they went in the early 1900s and they settled in Arizona. And he built up this ranch on very, very unpromising land, and was one of a number of small homesteaders in a part of very, very far southern Arizona, literally only a few kilometers from the Mexican border. The problem was that prior to the arrival of all these homesteaders, this had been open range. You know, if you're into your westerns, you'll know what I'm talking about. And that meant that big cattlemen, big cattle companies, that's what they had become by the 20th century, were allowed to roam their animals on federal land, basically free of charge. When the homesteaders started to move in, that right wasn't completely rescinded. They could still roam their cattle on a vacant federal land, but there wasn't as much vacant federal land. And it's kind of like that, the great song in Oklahoma, the farmer and the cowman should be friends. You know, but they're not going to be friends because their interests are antithetical. And Jack Clinton basically fell foul of a big cattle company which had its headquarters in California, the Kern Cattle Company, but it owned a local Arizona cattle company called the Boquillas Cattle Company, and they were constantly at loggerheads. And they were, you know, taking lumps out of each other, basically. And one day, June of 1915, somebody in the Boquillas Cattle Company obviously decided that Jack Clinton had gone too far. What he had done was, he was what they call a brand inspector. He had this semi-official function, a state function, and at auctions, he would supervise the sale of cattle. And if he was unhappy with the brand, he would basically say, no, you can't sell those cattle. We're not sure what the provenance of those cattle is, so you can't sell them here. And he had questioned the brand on some steers that had been put up for auction by the Boquillas Cattle Company. Later on that night, two cowboys, both employees of the Boquillas Cattle Company, one of them was this gentleman here, Ed Scarborough, who had been a lawman, and another guy called Calvin Cox, arrived at Jack Clinton's ranch. Asked to speak to Clinton. Clinton came out. The door was answered by his daughter, Rose Clinton, who died only in the year 2000, actually, on that ranch, still living on that ranch after 85 years. And she watched the whole thing as it unfolded. So Jack Clinton comes out. He is wearing moccasins. He's unarmed, and an altercation follows. And Ed Scarborough puts 4 bullets into him, one of which kills him. Rose Clinton, his daughter, who was about 11, 12 years of age at the time, witnessed the entire thing. Scarborough and Cox. Cox doesn't get off his horse. Scarborough and Cox light out for the border, and after a few days, they're both captured and they're both put on trial. Cox is acquitted because Rose Clinton testifies to the fact that he never got down off his horse. So he's acquitted. Scarborough is sent to jail for manslaughter for 10 years and escapes after a year. So that is basically the story of my cousin, Jack Clinton, in Arizona. Interestingly, and you'll appreciate this, given your own background in terms of digital research, I researched the 2 Arizona chapters of this book in Ireland. And then my wife and child and I went to Berkeley. She was a visiting professor for 6 months, and I researched all the Irish chapters, thanks to the military archives and your own beloved 1901-1911 census. I researched them all from Berkeley, from the library in the University of California, Berkeley. I brought one book with me, which was specifically about the War of Independence in Meath. That's the only book I brought with me. The rest of it was all.
It's all getting a lot easier. And
it's getting so much. Anybody can do it. It's fantastic.
And particularly for micro history, looking at particular individuals. The story of Jack Clinton, I don't know if any of you have seen Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino's masterpiece, which is based on the Johnson County Wars in Wyoming, and absolutely captures in the most vivid way that battle between the cattle barons and the homesteaders in this case. Have
you seen the 4.5-hour version of it?
I have. It's my favourite movie.
One of my favourite movies as well.
I'd love to see the 5-hour version. Of course, it broke United Artists.
Yes, it did indeed,
Which was a tragedy.
Wonderful book by a guy called Stephen Bochco.
I've read it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
Now, here we are.
Anyway.
Getting distracted. My fault in that case. Okay, now we're moving back to County Meath, where you still are and run the wonderful Hinterland Festival every year, which I have the pleasure to come and talk at very
We
regularly.
exploit you on an almost annual basis, underpay you.
It's always a wonderful thing to do and a delightful place to be. So, we're going to move on to Mark Clinton, who's directly related to you and is a cousin of Jack Clinton's, whose death was
He's nephew, actually, yeah. His dad is a cousin, or is a brother, actually, of Jack Clinton.
So, one of the most interesting issues, Myles, that you raise in the book is land hunger. Now, we all kind of think we know about land hunger, but your take on it is the parallel conflict that's going on during the War of Independence and presumably also the Civil War, which is about land grabbing and various aspects of how that works. Maybe talk to us a little about that, because it gives the background to...
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in the topic, or if you become interested in the topic, I would recommend going to the Military Archives website and having a look at two very, very extensive, very long and very detailed witness statements. One is from a northern judge called Kevin O'Sheil, who was a barrister, but became a judge in the Sinn Féin courts. And the other is Caird Davitt, who was also a young barrister. And
it was Michael Davitt's
son. He's Michael Davitt's son, yeah. And he also becomes a judge in the Sinn Féin courts. And a lot of what they write about is what I talk about in the book. Because there was this other war going on during the War of Independence. And it finally came to a head. I mean, the murder of Mark Clinton was one of the things that brought it to a head. Because Mark Clinton was murdered. He was an IRA volunteer, but he was murdered he was not executed by the IRA for spying or something like that. He was not killed by the RIC. He was not killed by the Black and Tans. He was killed by the members of a local gang known as the Cormean Gang, or rather melodramatically, the Black Hand Gang. Cormean is a tiny little village tucked away in the sort of top left-hand corner of County Meath. It's a spit away from the Cavan border. And there was a gang of them, and there were about a dozen or so of them, and they were basically seizing land in the area and doing so very violently. They were forcing people off their farms, blowing up people's houses and that kind of thing. And this was not just going on in this tiny little corner of County Meath. This was going on all over the country. And it was particularly going on in counties where, particularly across the North Midlands, from Meath, Cavan, all the way not so much Longford, because Longford was more of a cockpit of the War of Independence, and Sean McKeown had things under lock in Longford, but particularly Roscommon, for example. So wherever there wasn't a lot of IRA activity, one of the reasons why there wasn't it was kind of, to some extent, it was cart and horse, self-fulfilling prophecy. One of the reasons why in these areas there wasn't that much IRA activity was that the IRA were essentially acting as a Republican police force, and they were having to curtail the activities of these land-grabbing gangs. So you didn't get it in Cork, you didn't get it in Kerry, you didn't get it in Limerick, you certainly didn't get it in Tipperary, obviously you didn't get it in Dublin because there was no land. But anyway, so this is going on right through, and O'Sheil and Caird Davitt write about it. And it goes right back to the land war. What was happening was, and Davitt talks about, he gives one particular instance of this guy who suddenly turns up, joins a local IRA unit. He's been living in the States for donkey's years. His family have been dispossessed during the land war, and he joins the local IRA unit, and with that IRA cachet, he basically forces the family that took over his family's farm in the 1880s off their land, 2 sisters and a brother, and it comes before a Sinn Féin court, and Céir Davitt rules in favour of the family and basically calls upon the members of the Republican police, who are arrayed at the back of the hall where the trial is taking place, and basically tells them to execute his orders. His order is not executed, and what happens eventually is that some agreement is come to, I think involving the Land Commission, and the family, the 2 sisters and the brother, are given land elsewhere, and essentially this guy is given back the land that was taken from his family, or when his family were evicted 40 years beforehand. And that's just one story. This was going on all over the place. And you had, in some cases, they were elements within the IRA who were using the IRA as an opportunity to settle scores that went back 40 years. In some cases, in the case of the Cormean gang, there were IRA volunteers involved in the Cormean gang on the QT, but it certainly did not have the approval of the local IRA. But they were mostly non-IRA figures. In fact, they were British Army veterans in a couple of cases, in 2 cases in particular. One was an RAF veteran, one was a Boer War veteran. But they were kind of a hodgepodge, just a local gang seizing land and deciding, I'll have that bit and I'll have that bit. And, I don't know whether you want me to go on or
No, that's great. I mean, you
that's the background.
You've told me, which I'm going to share with the audience, that your next book is going to be about the land struggle, which is very good news because we badly need this. We're not going to understand what really happened during this decade of centenaries that we're making our way slowly through until we understand the land question. And I think, Myles, your contribution to that in this book is really helpful because it draws attention to a whole series of discontents that we kind of might have thought were settled by the Land Commission at that stage. Certainly not. Okay, so having told us all that, Mark Clinton.
Yeah.
Tell us about what happened.
Okay, Mark Clinton. So the Clintons are a relatively well-to-do family who live in and around Cormean, a tiny little town down called Clogher, which is beside Cormean, and they farm, good-sized farm, around about 100 acres, so they're relatively prosperous. They are related to and neighbours of a family called Smith, and they're married into, the 2 families are married into each other. One of the Smiths has, however, he has land in and around Clogher, Cormean, but his main farm is located on the road between Kells and Navan, a place called Kilmaine and Wood, and that's where he lives. The Cormean gang decide they're going to seize the land that he's not occupying, because what you've got during this period also is you have the rise of the rancher, the rise of the grazier, and you have land which has now been allocated, has been taken out of tillage and is moving into pasture. What that means, of course, is that there are lots of landless labourers, there are lots of very small farmers who do not have the possibility of getting land because this land is now being used for grazing. And if you know Meath, you'll know that that's the case with Knobson in that county. So what this gang decide to do is that they're going to take Smith's second farm, which he's renting out, and they begin to threaten him, and he then goes to his cousins, the Clintons, and says, will you back me up? And he actually offers Joe Clinton, who is the father of Mark Clinton, he offers him at a reduced rate, he offers him a few acres, a field. Where are we? The field is... That's the field, okay? He offers him this field at a knocked about a third of what he would normally expect to pay. So the Clintons decide, okay, maybe they had economic reasons for doing it as well, but they decide that they will back up the Smiths, that they will rent the land, and that they will make sure that the Cormean gang don't go anywhere near it. So they move in May of 1920, and one of the Clintons, Peter Clinton goes in and starts to plough the land and is immediately attacked. He's fired on, doesn't know from where. He's hit, he's not seriously wounded. And then the following day, his brother, or a couple of days later actually, his brother Mark Clinton, his older brother, who's an IRA volunteer. Peter Clinton is not in the IRA at this stage. Mark Clinton goes in and starts with 2 plough horses and starts ploughing the field. And some hours later, his father finds him dying in the field. The 2 plough horses have been shot dead, and his son is dying. What emerges is that when he started ploughing the field, Mark Clinton was approached by a group of about 5 people, one of whom was armed. There was some kind of an altercation, and he's shot, and he dies. As to whether he identified the 5 people who were involved in killing him, because he was still alive, he was able to talk to his father, I'm 90% certain he did. The father denied this at the inquest, but he wouldn't he? Because his father knew. His son, Mark Clinton's brother, Patrick Clinton, was the intelligence officer for the Meath IRA, lived in Dunboyne, and was very close to Sean Boylan, who was the officer commanding the Meath IRA. So Joe Clinton knew damn well that it would be that this atrocity would be dealt with in an extrajudicial, extra-legal fashion. So when it came to the formal inquest, he said that his son had not told him who the 5 people were. But within a very short period of time, the IRA know exactly who was involved in the killing. They know all of the members of the gang, and they round up the members of the gang in an operation that takes place in one night. They miss one of them, and that's crucial as part of the story.
That's William Gordon, who we'll come to in a moment. You're very interesting on the whole matter of the IRA rounding up people and taking them to an unknown destination.
Yes, yeah. That was the cliche. That became a cliche during the War of Independence. Unknown destination.
But it's fascinating from the book the number of possible unknown destinations where they could safely take prisoners to interrogate them and do whatever they needed.
Yeah, I mean, some of them were safe houses that were being looked after
yeah.
by people, where they were very welcome. But other ones, where his gang was rounded up, they were taken to a big house, lovely old house in a place called Kilskeer, which is a lovely village where the man who wrote "We'll Keep the Red Flag Flying," Jim Keelan, was born. It's a place called Boltown Hall, and it was unoccupied at the time. It was owned by a racehorse trainer who had trained a wonderful horse who won the Grand National twice, a horse called Manifesto. And some of them were actually dumped into, Manifesto was dead obviously at this stage, it was in the 1890s he won the Grand National, but they were thrown into Manifesto's stable.
And you have a lovely detail about the stables being lined with marble.
Yes, Manifesto's stable was lined with marble.
I'm not sure if horses like being in marble.
I'm sure they did, yeah.
It's kind of cool as a thing.
So they're basically they're kept under lock and key in this unoccupied large house, Boltown Hall. And one of the IRA volunteers talks about Michael Collins actually visiting, and a guy called he calls him Noyak. Noik was his name. He was an IRA solicitor, basically. He represented Sinn Féin and convicted or accused members of the IRA in Dublin in many cases, and he was a kind of legal advisor, if you like, to Collins. Sean Boylan, who was the father of the greatest GAA coach of all time.
No bias there.
No, better than Kevin Harford and better than any Dublin coach. Anyway, he and Collins were both members of the IRB, and were very, very close. They were personal friends, and so Collins was down checking because this was unique. The murder of Mark Clinton was unique in that this was the only occasion in which the IRA put anybody on trial for murder during the course of the War of Independence, and actually executed somebody for murder. They didn't leave it to the civil authorities, and there's a very good reason why they didn't leave it to the civil authorities.
Okay, so let's move on smoothly, as you've set it up for us, to William Gordon, who was the person not captured at
Yeah.
the time of the IRA's rounding up of the rest of the Black Hand gang.
Yeah.
Tell us about him. He's the person who did the actual killing.
William
and
Gordon.
his then becomes the third killing.
He becomes the third killing. William Gordon was a Presbyterian from a small townland called Trohanny near Bailieborough in County Cavan. And he had joined the IRA. He was one of these wonderful, a bit like the British Army or British Forces equivalent of the Fusiliers. As you're probably aware, right at the end, the last 3 months of the First World War, recruitment in Ireland absolutely shot up, and you had 10,000 people joining the British Armed Forces in the last 3 months of the war, knowing damn well that they would never hear a single shot fired in anger. Of the 10,000, half of them joined the Royal Air Force. Because maybe they had some romantic idea of becoming pilots, or maybe they just wanted to be trained as engineers and fitters. And that's what happened. This guy, William Gordon, was trained as a fitter, but he was also given weapons training, and he used it to kill Mark Clinton. When Boylan sets off on this nighttime expedition and rounds up, they rounded up a dozen, in actual fact. They let 3 of them go, and they have ended up convicting 9 of them. The one person they missed was the one person they really wanted, and that was William Gordon. Because William Gordon had just prior to the IRA operation been lifted by the RIC. He'd been arrested by the RIC on very, very spurious grounds indeed. Not for the murder of Mark Clinton, but for possession of a weapon. And he ends up, he's sent to Mountjoy, and he's brought down from Mountjoy a few weeks later, and he's put on trial in Navan, and he's acquitted. But I have no doubt whatever that somebody in the Meath IRA, the Meath IRA was, I think, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest, was very, very heavily infiltrated by spies. The Meath IRA spent most of its time not killing members of the RIC or members of the Black and Tans. They didn't get a single Black and Tan during the course of the War of Independence, but by God, they killed a lot of spies and informers, proportionately more than any other county in Ireland, including Cork, in proportion to the number of casualties. In Cork, 10% of the fatalities in the War of Independence were IRA victims of IRA executions. In Meath, it's more than 50% of the fatalities. So, Meath IRA heavily infiltrated, RIC undoubtedly tipped off. Very, very likely, Gordon and some of the members of the Cormean gang are acting as agent provocateur for the RIC, so he is protectively lifted, and they come up with this spurious offence. I suspect also that when he went into Mountjoy, that he was being used in Mountjoy to spy on other prisoners, and that was something that they did. That the Dublin Castle authorities did a lot, is that they would put people into the Joy and as prisoners, and that they would be spying on the IRA prisoners. So anyway, they don't get Gordon, which really annoys Boylan. So Boylan has a particular interest in the trial at the assizes of William Gordon. Gordon is brought back down from Dublin to Navan, and he appears before the assizes. The case is over within minutes, and Boylan almost misses him. But fortunately, a reporter, who I suspect was an uncle or grandfather or something like that of the great Meath footballer Liam Hayes, tips off Boylan that Gordon has been acquitted and Gordon has been released, and Gordon is now about to head for the hills. So Boylan orders every pub in Navan to be searched, and they get lucky, they find him. Instead of getting the hell out of Navan and getting as far away as possible, Gordon, who has suddenly come into money, nobody knows how, but Gordon is drinking with 2 members of the RIC in a place called the Flathouse Pub, a stone's throw from the railway station in Navan, where presumably he intends to go after he finishes drinking. He doesn't get that opportunity. Boylan comes in with a revolver, holds up the 2 RIC men, puts Gordon into a car, drives him to his own bailiwick of Dunboyne, and he's held there for a number of weeks. He's put on trial twice, and it's extremely kosher. This is not an IRA kangaroo court or anything like that. They bring down very, very high-ranking IRA officials, officers from Dublin, and he is put on trial and he's found guilty of murder. And Boylan is not quite sure exactly what he should do with them because it's a capital offence and the penalty is death. So Boylan goes to Collins and consults Collins. Collins consults the cabinet. The cabinet demurs, in particular Countess Markievicz and Ernest Blythe.
Who I never thought had a heart until now.
Well, no, it may have been something to do with the fact that both of them were Presbyterians.
True.
Might have had something to do with it, I don't know.
And I didn't think Constance Markievicz was too bothered either about extrajudicial executions.
We could divert into an interesting
We could, but we
conversation
won't.
about the Countess, but we won't.
It's too
I
tempting.
don't think, I'm certainly not a fan, but anyway, I don't think you are either. But
I prefer her sister, let's put it that way.
yes, very much so.
So, okay, fire ahead.
Anyway, yeah,
They demur.
And what happens is that Boylan is told, put him on trial again.
Okay.
They put him on trial again with a similar high-ranking group of three judges who are brought down.
And there's a defence attorney,
Oh yeah,
all prosecution,
absolutely,
lawyer, all of that.
It's all kosher. It's all very, very kosher. It's not a Sinn Féin court in the sense that you don't have Kevin O'Sheil or Claire Davitt, but it's a court martial because
Sure.
there are three. It's as much of a court martial as the 1916 courts martial were, and probably about as legal. But anyway. At the second time round, he's also found guilty. Boylan goes back to Collins, says, what do we do? Collins says, do what you like. And Boylan decides, I'm going to execute him. And Boylan personally is involved personally in the execution of William Gordon, whose body is dumped in a quarry in somewhere around Dunboyne, and his body's never been found. So it's out there somewhere. William Gordon does not rest peacefully.
Well, that story sheds light on the whole business of land hunger and land grabbing and parallel struggles with the one for independence. The last one, the fourth story, is the story of Patrick Keelan. And this brings you into another interesting discourse on spies and informers. You've said a little about it already. That how this operates in terms of the IRA. I was amazed to read the disproportionate number of spies and informers killed in Meath compared to other places.
Yeah.
I was really surprised by that. That's one of the really surprising things of many that come out in the book here. But Patrick Keelan is executed for being a spy, an informer, by a group including some of your McKenna relatives who are now moving into the purview of the McKenna family. This was a very reckless, very young man, Patrick Keelan. But tell us how this came to pass.
Yeah, these are T.P. McKenna and Sarah Clinton. So that's my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather. So the Clintons and the McKennas were married, both from Mulla in County Cavan, and both married. So we're moving now from her relatives to his sons, basically. What happens is that as I say, the Meath IRA heavily infiltrated and very focused in 1921 on shooting informers, and that's really almost their entire focus. And they get through at least 8 of them, which is a lot when you consider that in County Meath during the War of Independence, the 2 years of the War of Independence, there were 6 military fatalities, 3 dead IRA, 3 dead Crown forces. But there are more, and I'm including William Gordon in that 8, so he's not technically a spy or an informer. So what happens in the case of this Patrick Keelan? Keelan is he's only 19 years old, he's only a kid basically, and he is what we would have called in rural Ireland in my youth a bit slow. In other words, he had learning difficulties, would be the modern way of referring to it. Worked on a farm as a farm labourer, fell out with the farmer, and decided to get his own back on the farmer, and thought, I had a great idea. Went to the authorities and said that the farmer was storing IRA weapons on his farm. the military, not the TANs, but the military, the South Wales borderers, come and search the farm. They find a few they find old shotgun stocks, of no great significance. But they decide, times being what they were, to lift the farmer and bring him up to Mountjoy. So he spends a month basically in jail in Mountjoy. The IRA take a very dim view of this for obvious reasons. They, in their turn, lift Patrick Keelan. They bring him to an unknown destination, which ironically is a deserted outhouse on a farm literally a few hundred meters away from where Mark Clinton was murdered. And they hold him there for a few days. They presumably rough him up a bit, they question him, and they send him on his way with his tail between his legs with the warning, be of good future behaviour. Rather foolishly, he decides he's going to get his own back on the IRA. Not a good move. And he goes to the South Wales borderers, he goes to the Black and Tans, he goes to the Crown Forces basically and offers himself as an identifier. This is a phrase. I think it was a phrase that was used at the time. Pádraig O'Rourke familiarised me with it. And identifiers used to go round with the TANs in Crossley tenders or armoured cars or whatever, and they would point out houses and say so and so lives there, or they would point out individuals and say so and so is the second in command of the local IRA unit or whatever. So they operated as spies. So he is doing this for a period of about 3 months, and he's locked away, he's kept safe by the Crown Forces, and he's going out from time to time and he's identifying. And this is known by the local IRA, so they are very anxious to talk to him. He at some point, Patrick Keelan feels lonely for his mammy, and he goes home to a little village of near Kilmainham Wood, and which is in County Cavan, just on the Cavan-Meath border. And of course, probably within minutes, the IRA get wind of the fact that he's there. They kidnap him, they take him, they put him on trial. And now this trial was nothing like the trial that William Gordon got. It was basically a very, very rapid court-martial. And the local unit of the IRA decide that they're going to dispatch Patrick Keelan. They must have been conscious of the fact that there would be local opposition to this. They must have been conscious of the fact that local people would know that Patrick Keelan was a bit of an idiot, that he was a bit slow, that he was not really responsible for his own actions. But they decide they're going to execute him anyway. But they don't do it themselves. And they basically go to the next unit across, which unfortunately for two of my granduncles and Anna Clinton cousin happens to be their unit, Mulla Minolty unit. And they basically recruit members of the Mulla Minolty unit to actually perform the execution, so that there won't be any local blood on the hands of the local commanders who actually convict him in the first place. So T.P. McKenna, who is the son of that T.P. McKenna, the youngest son of that T.P. McKenna, John McKenna, his older brother, both of whom are in the IRA. T.P. McKenna has been in the IRA in Dublin. He was a medical student in UCD. He was in the same class as Kevin Barry. He was friends of Kevin Barry. And then after Bloody Sunday, even though he wasn't, I'm not aware, there's no evidence that he was directly involved, he's basically sent back down to Cavan-Meath to organise a flying column. And he's involved in the organisation of the flying column. So you have T.P. McKenna, John McKenna, and Peter Clinton, who is their cousin, who is the brother of Mark Clinton, who's the guy who was shot in the field by the Cormean gang a couple of days before Mark Clinton is murdered. And they are brought to a very pretty part of the country, a wood, doesn't look at all sinister, Garryard Wood outside Minolty, which adjoined McKenna land, which was worked by John McKenna at the time. And a grave is dug for Patrick Keelan, and he's shot, and he's put in the grave. And I don't know specifically what part T.P. McKenna or Peter Clinton played, but you can be damn sure that it was the the night of the 1st and 2nd of July 1921. You can be damn sure the IRA did not bring along too many observers. That anybody who was, who went there was involved. They were either involved. The grave had been dug by a couple of local kids. They hadn't even dug the graves themselves. Shallow grave. John McKenna, we know definitely, and I came across this, and I had the difficult task of informing his cousin, or my cousin, his son, that his father had been involved in the execution of somebody, and it all added up for Joe. Joe's my cousin, Joe McKenna. He's brought to this wood, and he's executed, and his body is buried there. I mentioned my cousin Joe. Joe is the son of John McKenna. John McKenna's witness statement, he states quite clearly that he was involved. He was in the firing squad. Doesn't say who else is in the firing squad, but he says he was in the firing squad. That's a place called Garryard Wood. A couple of 100 meters away, in a slight, different direction, there's another wood. It's a lovely countryside. It looks like something you'd see in the First World War in Picardy in France. And there's another wood nearby. In that wood, to this day, is the body of another IRA victim, a man called Bradley, a postman from Carnaross called Bradley, who's brought to this wood, Rathmanu Wood it's called. He's shot, he's buried, his body is never recovered. It's still there somewhere. It's still in that wood somewhere. Keelan is then executed in this wood a couple of hundred meters away. And I'd go on, if you like, about what happened to the body subsequently.
I think because we want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, so it's an extraordinary story. And one of the admirable things about all of this is your capacity to contemplate the activities of your own predecessors, your ancestors in all of this, which is one of the things that's coming out of this new interest in personal history during the War of Independence and the Civil War. People are confronting things about their own pasts that are sometimes very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to watch that happen and to see how honourable people are.
Yeah, Joe McKenna, who's my cousin, who's an absolutely lovely guy. He's the nicest, gentlest person you could possibly meet, as was his father. His father was just the most sweet, affable, wonderful individual. Joe told me the story that because he lived around that area there where that wood is, and he used to play around that area. And one day he said to his father was asking him, "What were you playing today? What were you doing today?" "Oh, we were looking for bodies in the wood, Dad." Because there was a local story that there were bodies in both of these woods. And Joe said it was the only time in his life he ever remembers his father getting angry. And he said, "Stop playing that game and do not go near those woods ever again." And Joe wondered why. And about a year and a half ago, I was able to tell him why.
Part of the long silence.
Yeah. John McKenna never spoke about the War of Independence. And John McKenna had a very honourable record in the War of Independence in the IRA. Stood up to the Black and Tans on a couple of occasions, was threatened that he would be killed and his house would be burnt down if he didn't repair a bridge that the IRA had destroyed, and basically refused and wouldn't allow anybody else to repair it either. Basically, that was Black and Tans. And so he had a very honourable but never, ever, ever talked about the War of Independence.
Of course, one of the reasons for firing squads is that no one in that squad knows who fired the fatal shot.
Who actually,
It's a way of protecting the shooters.
And they copied, they did, there's a notion that IRA executions were, bullet to the head. They weren't, during the War of Independence. During the Troubles, yes, not during the War of Independence, because they aped the British fire. They didn't have, a dozen or half a dozen shooters. They generally would have had three shooters. But John McKenna also then a couple of years later, for a variety of reasons, was forced to disinter the body of Patrick Keelan. Because the family were hassling the Free State government. What happened to him is he buried in consecrated ground. So I've come across documentation whereby it's very clear that what happened was that the body was disinterred, and that was part of McKenna family tradition, that John McKenna had been involved in the exhumation of the body of Patrick Keelan.
But not the execution.
No, but not the execution. And I'm morally certain that this is where he's buried. That's the McKenna family plot in Malnati Cemetery. That's my daughter, and so she's the great-great-granddaughter of T.P. McKenna. And I think that he was probably, because the Free State government are able to send a letter to the Keelans to say, yes, your son is buried in consecrated ground. And I think that's where he's buried. 20 years later, my twin, I never met them because they died before I was born, long before I was born, my twin brother and sister are buried in that grave, beside the body, somewhere near the body of Patrick Keelan, who their uncle would have executed in 1921.
It's an astonishing story, Myles. I think you've given us a really good picture of the killings that you describe in the book, but also the interlinking discourses that you have about different things there. But in case you think this is a very grim read, I just want to quote you a few of Myles's smart remarks, of which there are many. And history is not just about telling you the facts, it's about how you tell them. A good writer makes all the difference, and this is a beautifully written book with lots of fun. So this is him on anonymous threatening letters to landlords. Quote, the early 20th century equivalent of today's courageous trolling keyboard warriors, giddy in the security of their anonymity, whose interventions on social media ensure such a heady level of lucid political discourse. End quote. Those who rejoined the IRA, which we mentioned earlier, when the end of the conflict was in sight, quote, some of those who never managed to find the time to spend hours in freezing damp fields, lying in wait for black and tan patrols that never came, made opportunistic comebacks once the truce had been declared. This was a nationwide phenomenon that led to the coinage of a fittingly caustic neologism. Those who returned were christened truceliers, or summer soldiers in some cases.
Summer soldiers, yeah.
On the rivalry between the IRA and the ancient order of Hibernians, who would have been huge supporters of the old Irish parliamentary party wiped out in the 1918 election, quote, the latter, that's the ancient order of Hibernians, often abetted by their tradition adversaries in the Orange Order. So this is a nationalist organisation combining with a virulently anti-nationalist one. And Myles says, the word irony simply cannot cope. Finally, perceptions of the IRA. Not everyone was convinced by notions of a chivalrous IRA populated by latter-day Cucullins. So, you're going to get plenty of fun out of the book. We could talk for another 2 hours about this. There's so much to reflect on. One thing I would love to ask you, but we're stuck for time, is to bring us through your sort of summing up of the period that you give us at the end of the book. But maybe somebody will ask you that and save me the trouble. Are we ready with microphones?
We are.
To be guided to microphones, should anyone want to ask a question? Anyone like to ask a question? Don't be shy. See a gentleman just here.
I think they want you to go, if you can go
to that microphone.
There's a microphone down there just so that everybody can hear you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sorry, I'm just putting my hinterland hat on here because this is one of the banes of our lives, is sort of people talking from the audience and nobody can hear them.
I've read the book and thoroughly enjoyed it, so congratulations.
Thank you.
I just want to ask you, you said that the Meath IRA were heavily infiltrated by spies. Would Sean Boylan, with his connections to Collins, not have sussed that at any stage?
Oh, he did. He did. But the problem was proof. If you read Sean Boylan's Bureau of Military History witness statement, and he makes very specific allegations against certain individuals. Now, you have to be careful with this. Katrina will tell you the same thing. The pension application files they're not impeccable, but they have a very, very high degree of accuracy.
And they're much closer in time to the things they're describing.
Well, yes,
memory
true.
Hasn't had time.
Yeah,
to
exactly. They're in some cases literally within only a couple of years, and generally speaking, no more than 10 or 15 years. The military history witness statements have the problem of the infamous corrosive memory. But also they have the problem of people settling scores. So you can never be entirely certain. Sean Boylan went on to become a general in the National Army. and recruited T.P. McKenna Jr., who became a colonel in the National Army. And some of the people that he has a go at, one in particular, who would have been a very prominent individual in Navan in the 1920s and 1930s. And Boylan accuses him of being an RUC or an RIC spy in his witness statement. Now, Boylan makes that statement safe in the knowledge that it will not appear until after he dies. He'll be long dead before it appears. So you can't be entirely certain. But he was aware. He and others. His deputy, Seamus Finn. Seamus Finn also makes a statement to the Bureau of Military History, and Finn talks a lot about how leaky the Meath IRA probably was. And certainly they went on the rampage. I mean, all of the spies and informers, and they attempted to kill a number of others. So the number certainly would have easily gone into double figures. And all of these were killed within a period of about 3 months in 1921. Bradley, who I mentioned, who was in Rathbunoo Wood, one of the body which is still there. He was the earliest one to be killed. He was killed in January. Keelan was the last one to be killed. And in between, they killed 5 or 6 others, and they attempted to kill 3 or 4 more. And they had others on their list. They had a list, very Gilbert and Sullivan. They had a little list. And had the truce, it's very interesting, it's fascinating, because if you read the Collins papers in the military archive, during the truce period, the IRA suddenly become very Teutonic, and everything is written down and everything is recorded, and intelligence officers from all over the country are sending reports to their regional intelligence officers, which in the case of my family means that Raphael McKenna, the father of the actor T.P. McKenna, who's the local intelligence officer in Mulla, is sending reports to Patrick Clinton, his cousin, who is the intelligence officer of the Eastern Division, and those are then being sent up to GHQ. And you can read all these; they're all in the Collins papers. But what's very interesting is I know in Meath, the monitoring of suspected spies, informers, people who were considered to be fellow travellers. The Meath IRA, you'll love this, the Meath IRA were monitoring the activities of every local golf club, cricket club and tennis club. And they list the names of people who are members of these bodies, who they suspect are either collaborators or have been collaborators or will be collaborators. All of this stuff is going on. So they are, by the end of the War of Independence, by the time the truce comes around, Boylan is absolutely paranoid, and he knows that the Meath IRA is very, very heavily infiltrated. They have a very, very high failure rate. A lot of operations that were planned and were due to take place, for some reason, don't happen. The TANs don't show up. Something goes wrong, and it's not like the weather changes or something like that. And I have no doubt that Boylan is absolutely right, and a lot of these operations are stymied because the authorities are informed. Now, it works both ways, because Dunshaughlin RIC station, as far as I can see, is infested with IRA fellow travellers, and some of the IRA killings and some of the IRA attempted killings come about because of information that has come from within Dunshaughlin RIC station to Boylan and to Patrick Clinton, to the intelligence officer of the Eastern Division of the IRA. So it does cut both ways, but they were heavily, heavily infiltrated, and that's why I think that when they went to round up the Cormean gang, the one they missed was the most important of all, was William Gordon.
Any other questions? There is. No. Yes, somebody over here. Would you mind doing the same, sir? There's someone to direct you there. Yeah.
sorry, this might be totally off topic, but can you explain what this obsession with the land, which resulted in all these killings, is kind of still part of our culture today with what's happened recently with some recent killings?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that I'm now beginning to research very, very specifically. And, you know, there's no doubt we have. In order to ensure that I got a contract from the nice people in Head of Zeus, I wrote an introduction to the book. And the introduction takes us back all of 11 years to the bailout. And to me being going into, I was talking to Katrina about this earlier, me going in on a Sunday evening in 2010 to do what I thought was going to be a history show, except that the IMF had arrived in town and the bailout was pending and there was going to be a press conference. So we suddenly decided, well, we're not doing a history show, and we went on air with nothing.
Doing history as it was made.
Doing history as it was made, basically. We had Peter Bacon, bless him, then an economist, later a Fine Gael TD,
who warned them 3 times.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So he was a good man, but he came into studio, so that was all we had. And so the introduction is basically all about our obsession with property. I mean, you know, and you can call it property, you can call it land, you can call it whatever you want. But it is in our DNA, and it's all about dispossession. And, you know, you could say it goes back to the famine, or you could say it goes back to 1641, but it's there. There's no doubt about it. And, you know, we're not, I mean, the notion of renting is still something that is absolutely anathema to the Irish people. And, you know, the Irish tenant farmers or whatever struggled for the guts of 100 years, basically, or longer, not in all cases, but in some cases, to become the owners and the proprietors of their own land. And this was the obsession.
And they succeeded,
yeah,
which is the fascinating thing.
Oh, yeah.
But others were left out.
Yes,
and
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
You have a very firm grasp of
Yeah.
who they were and why.
Yeah.
So, folks, we'll be back here again, I think, in about 3 years' time. When Myles says 3 years, I'm giving you, honey. And in that time, I
Head
have
of
to
Zeus
get
are not giving me
access to
3
the
years.
land
They're giving me a
commission.
year and a half.
Okay. But get on it, because this is such an important question. And the question asked by the gentleman just there goes to the heart of something we haven't really explored to the extent that we need to have a full understanding, not just of what happened 300, 200, 100 years ago, but right now. So when Myles writes that book, I'm putting a very light burden on your shoulders, my friend. We'll be back in here talking about that. I think we're short of time now, Bert, am I right?
Yes, I think so,
Yeah. Unless, one more question, do you think? If there is one.
If there is one from the audience, there's still
Okay.
time for
Anybody
one.
want to ask one last question?
Down the
Yes,
back
down
there.
at the very back there.
Just come up to the mic.
Okay, just wander up to the microphone. Thank you.
It's like an American town hall meeting, isn't it? It's like Parks and Recreation.
Thanks for that, Myles. Just a quick question. You've probably come across the Renting Commission that looked at a lot of Protestant claims. I noticed in West Cork that there was a lot of Protestants that there was a land grab on them. Is there anything like that going up in Meath?
No. Very interesting. None of the IRA victims in County Meath, with the exception of William Gordon, were Protestant. Gordon has nothing to do with, he's not a spy, he's not an informer, he's a murderer, and he is executed as somebody who has committed a capital offence. All of the victims in Meath, and now I think there was in Cavan, there was a local Church of Ireland rector who is pretty viciously murdered, as far as I recall. But in Meath, no, they're all Catholics. All of the victims are Catholic. Now, having said that, almost all of them have some connection, former connection to the security forces. So they were World War I veterans. In one case, there was somebody who was a retired member of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, but they were all Catholic. So that kind of suspicion, or more than a suspicion, And certainly there have been some very interesting, and some would say ill-informed books, others would say well-informed books, written about anti-Protestant pogroms in Cork, for example, or in Munster. But that certainly wasn't the case. It wasn't in Meath. In fact, in Meath it was more likely, and this was a bit embarrassing for the IRA in Meath. In Meath it was more likely that if you were a Protestant landowner and somebody who was not a member of the IRA came and robbed, because there was a lot of opportunism going on, and there was a lot of crime going on, a lot of people arriving in the dead of night with guns and into a big house and stealing the contents of the big house. And Sean Boylan was called upon to investigate, or decided on a number of occasions to investigate some of these robberies that were taking place. And on many occasions, and on one notable occasion in particular, he actually arrived up to the house of a very, very prominent local unionist landowner and handed him back everything and told him, by the way, it was stolen by X, Y, and Z. We have them in custody at the moment, and the proceeds of the crime were about to be fenced by the local RIC man. He had had a conversation with Boylan before, and Boylan had offered to try and track down the criminals, and this unionist grandee had basically dismissed him and said, the RIC are investigating. And Boylan was able to tell him that it was an RIC man who was going to fence the proceeds of the burglary. So that's the kind of thing that was going on. I'm not saying that they were without sin or without blemish. There's no doubt about it. They weren't without blemish. But that's the kind of stuff wasn't going on in this particular bailiwick anyway. All the victims were Catholic.
We've lots more to learn about all of this. Just to say to you all, for those of you who don't already know about the Bureau of Military History, which Myles has referred to several times to witness statements.
I lived there.
I know.
Online.
Me too. I mean, I got them released to the public.
You did, I know.
Which I was very pleased with after years and years of fighting to have it. You go online, you just put in Bureau of Military History into Google, and up straight away it will come. 35,000 pages of testimony given by people active from 1913 up to 1921 during the revolutionary period in their own words. So it's the oral history of the revolutionary period. Beware, because you'll go down a rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah.
And once you start, it's very hard to stop.
Even though they weren't supposed to talk about the Civil War,
they did.
A lot of them did. And that's going to be very, very interesting now when it comes to the commemoration.
We need Eve Morrison, God bless her, to finish her book on the Bureau and give it to us so we can have a guide. But it is a wonderful way to pass the time should you be bored. I think a lot of people during lockdown got great solace from the Bureau of Military History, because it was damn all else to do except investigate their ancestors' behaviour, which of course Myles has done so brilliantly for us in this book, and I really commend it to you. There is an aspect of a thriller about it, that you're dying to know what happens next. Who will the next killing be? Slightly macabre, but it's all there. And it's liberally peppered with his own observations on matters of great importance, including a brilliant summing up at the end of what he thinks. He has a very beady eye in terms of looking at the revolutionary period. He couldn't be accused of being sentimental about it or about the Free State which succeeded all of that. And that's reflected also in his own capacity to look at his own ancestors with an unprejudiced eye, which is part, I think, of the great fruit of these archival legacies that we have.
I'd love for my granny to come back, and I'd love to have a chat with her now.
I'm sure you would. I wish I could step in, but alas, don't have that capacity. Could you all please thank Myles Dungan for a wonderful
Thank you.
Cool.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, before you leave your seats, I do want to tell you, due to COVID restrictions, we can't have any book signings, but Myles has signed copies of his book already, and they're available to buy from our friends in the Gunner Bookshop out in the lobby. Our next event is at 4:30 p.m. It features Dermot Ferreter talking about his book, Between Two Hells, The Irish Civil War, with Ronan McCreevy. And in the meantime, please join me in thanking our speakers, Myles Dungan and Katrina Quill. Thank you very much.